So Genesis 25 is where I want to start from today. Kind of grown up in church, I always, just as a kid, I always heard the big stories about David and Abraham and all those, and so I always just assumed that these people in the Bible were really just great and perfect. Just as a kid, you hear all the big stories. But I didn't really know until I became an adult, came back to church, that actually David was pretty messed up, and so was Abraham. And so all these people had to grow and learn and become better and better as they grew. And so we come to the story of Jacob in chapter 25, and this is where Isaac has children. Finally, he's 60 years old. It says we'll start in verse 19. An account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayers, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is called Edom. So Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is my birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. So I am obviously not Kevin Holt, so I'm not going to go real deep theologically, but what I want to do is do more a character study today on Jacob. And when I was at the mission, I often use this story to help guys kind of relate to the story of addiction. And what I would ask them to do in the study is identify what Jacob's addiction was. And it wasn't drugs or alcohol, so it was deceiving, conning. He was a con. And I'll tell you that when I was at the mission at that time, there were been through the years I had met guys who were really good at lying. In fact, they got so good at it, they believed their lies. And even if you could prove it wrong, they still believed it and kept going. And I think actually what happens is, and this gets into other stuff, I don't go too far with it, but neurologically, your brain can develop habits that it keeps repeating, and it gets to a place where it becomes normal for you. And so this is what happens when sin keeps going. If you keep in a habitual sin, it becomes more and more normalized. And so that's when the person can get more and more cold in their heart, or seem like they get colder and colder, less able to be corrected. And this is kind of what Jacob was doing. In this study this morning, what I'd like to do is be able to, the three objectives: view the sovereignty of God in partnership with our volitional responsibility. And even when sin breaks up families and hurts others, how does God's grace and his promises, joined with our responses, restore the hope of family reconciliation? And how can glad tidings help other families find this hope? So in this story, as we look at it, and I like reading the Bible, and I like getting into the stories of the people that are in there, because it really helps me connect my life when I get in and understand people. And what I like to do is when I'm reading it and breaking it down, when I'm going down through everything that they say in their conversations, and we'll do this morning, as you go down through this story and you listen to how they're reacting to each other, you really begin to say, well, some of you might say, this is kind of like my family. this is what I would say is, this sounds familiar, is people saying things to each other and you go, this is really wild. This is, these people should be able to say, there's something wrong with our family. Now Isaac is the promised son of Abraham, obviously, and so we see that, we say, for me anyway, at first I look at Isaac and I'm thinking he's the promised son. So this is the one that through the lineage would come the promise of Christ, the Messiah. And so this big covenant promise. But we see Isaac doing things that we think, that's not very godly. And it's kind of amazing. It helps us see the sovereignty of God. But it also helps us see that we have relational responsibility. The story of Jacob's family is one of dysfunction, deception, and betrayal. In spite of our sinful nature, God's intervention offers a perspective on his saving grace and faithfulness throughout history, not only for Jacob, but for us as well. In the Pentateuch are 5 overarching themes, so just to try and mix in some theology, there are 5 overarching themes throughout the whole Pentateuch, and those 5 themes are the sovereignty of God, the history, the fallen condition of humanity, and then salvation and holiness. I'm hoping to next week talk about salvation and holiness from Jacob's life. This morning what I want to do is be able out of Jacob's life to pinpoint the first 3, sovereignty of God, history, and the fallen condition of humanity. So in the sovereignty of God, the first overarching theme, the Pentateuch demonstrates God's supreme dominion by rehearsing his dealings with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Throughout their lives, wherever they traveled, God assured them of his presence, protection, and guidance. God is sovereign as creator, and as such has no geographic or cultural limits. So God's sovereignty is evidenced in Scripture because he could go geographically anywhere he wanted. Other gods and other religions had gods that were limited to their culture or to their geography. So God is in control. He's sovereign. In verse 21, Isaac prays for his wife because he notices that she's obviously not having a child. He knows that's supposed to happen. So he goes to God. He prays for her. Rebecca, after she gets pregnant, she prays because she has a concern. There's something going on inside of her. These babies are jostling and she doesn't know why. And so God tells her, he says, well, what's going on is you have 2 nations inside of you, 2 separate nations. Esau's one of them, and Jacob is going to be the other one. And so she prays. Esau is one that becomes the future Edomites, which later on is prophesied in Malachi, when God destroys them and turns their land over and wipes them out. So, but Jacob's name means one who grasps the heel, or figuratively, he deceives. And yet God would make him the progenitor of his chosen nation of Israel. So why would God choose someone who is a deceiver to build a nation of Israel? And why would God say that? Later on we see that he hated Esau. So why does God, in his sovereignty, he looks at one and he says, I hate this one, but this one I love. And the one he loves is Jacob, but he's a deceiver. So what gives God the desire to choose a deceiver, a liar? That's for you.
When God says, I love one and I hate the other, back then, hate didn't necessarily mean hate. It is, I love you less than I love the first one.
Right.
That goes back to Deuteronomy on Moses, when he says, if you have 2 wives, one you love, one you hate, meaning that the second wife you just love less.
Good. Yeah. Good answer. Anybody else?
Jacob was the one that listened to God and spent time with God, even though he was a deceiver. He still talked to God and spent time with him. We don't know how much Esau spent time with God or had God as a part of his life. So when we spend time with God, no matter what our weaknesses are in us, if we spend time with God, then he's going to watch over us and and love us and take care of us.
Yeah. And that was always what occurred to me too, is when I read it. Every time I read Jacob, I was so thankful, because God can take you no matter where you're at, no matter how you behave or misbehave, and He's got a plan for your life, a redemptive plan. So I think the only difference between Esau and Jacob was not that one was better than the other, but that one had a heart toward God. He was receptive to God, whereas Esau obviously wasn't. So I know that's real simple. I know that wasn't a hard question, but I don't want to, can't make it too hard. A lot of you guys are smarter than I am, so here we go. So the parents had divided affections, and this is something where we see the family break down. Now, Isaac got this promised woman by divine means. Remember Abraham's servant? Abraham made him swear. He said, you go and get my son a wife. And I wish it were this easy. You go and get my son a wife. And so this guy goes and he sits down and he's praying, because he's desperately like, please, Lord, I don't want to fail my master. This could be trouble for me. So show me the wife. And he goes to a certain area and he sits down at a well. And so the lady comes out, if you know the story, and it's Jacob's future, or Isaac's future wife. And she comes out and she says exactly what the test was, that she would offer to water his camels, and not only that, give him some water also. And so he said, this is the girl. And so he hooks up with her, takes her back home, she becomes the wife. So this is ordained of God. It was supernatural. This marriage was put together. And you would think that would just make marriage wonderful, wouldn't it? But apparently, at some point, the marriage relationship began to change. And if they would have had, like Bob and Rena, to do some marriage coaching, it could have helped them out. They didn't have anybody back then, apparently. But their marriage begins to change when the boys begin to grow up. And I like what it says is that Isaac, and it says parenthetically, he loved wild game, loved Esau. So he liked that meat. Esau was a deer hunter. He's out in the deer stand, the tree stand all day, hunting big game, brings it in, and Dad's like, I love this kid. He brings me T-bones every day. Jacob's sitting around at the tents, probably stirring lentil soup, which is not really much at all. And he's just hanging around the tents, kind of quiet. He might have been a reader. He might have been studying the scrolls. And so, like you were saying, he kind of studied. He was maybe, in that way, he was connecting with God through reading the scrolls and studying. And so we got these two different guys, these two different sons. But you notice Mom loves one, and I don't know, we can't read more into it than what it is, but was Mom just rescuing Jacob because his dad didn't like him as well? But the two, she loved Jacob more, he loved Esau more. And when parents show more allegiance to one child than the other, there's going to be a problem in the family. And so it begins to break down here. And we see later on in the story too that Mom does some things that are really just out there. The parents are divided in their affections. With all the dysfunction of parents, grandparents, and wrestling twins, God kept His plan in view. Christ our Messiah and a multitude of redeemed before His throne. God was, while He was working in this situation, He was looking at Jacob and saying, this guy has a heart toward me. He's a mess. He lies and deceives. He stole Esau's birthright. At least they say he stole it, but Esau gave it up real quick because he was just hungry. He just came in from the fields and didn't get anything, and so he's coming in, and here's Jacob, and it says he stayed by the tents, so he's right by the tents. I mean, the refrigerator's just right in there, so why are you begging for lentil stew of all things? And he's sitting there stirring some lentil stew. And I don't know if you guys have seen lentil stew. You probably have. It's kind of like black-eyed peas, isn't it? Just a little, nothing great. I mean, I'd rather have soup, beans, and cornbread or something, but lentil stew, I'm not going to give up my birthright for that. But he's famished. Well, you're really not. And if you can stand there and tell somebody you're famished, you're probably not famished. You'd probably still make it a few more feet to the refrigerator and get something out, but he didn't. He just right there. He had to have it right now. And so he gives up his birthright just that easy. And so it just shows Esau's heart. That he's not really willing to move toward God or hang on to God over his stomach. This guy couldn't have fasted longer than an hour. And so, in Romans 9:10 through 18 and 31 through 32, it said that Jacob displayed a faith by his eager desire for the promise, even though by ill-gotten means. Whereas Esau forsook the birthright in order to temporarily gratify his stomach. Jacob had a faith, whereas Esau relied on his birth order. And to me, that's kind of like the law. When he's relying on his relationship as the oldest, and it's a Jewish tradition that this will get my birthright no matter what. I can do whatever I want, I can be reckless because I'm in the order. Well, you'll notice throughout Scripture, God doesn't usually follow that firstborn stuff. And I think sometimes in America we still follow that firstborn, that my firstborn son or my firstborn whatever, and God doesn't really follow that tradition. That's just something that they did in Jewish tradition. So they had King David was the last in the line. It seemed like everywhere you look throughout the Scripture, God was usually choosing the opposite of what we men would choose. Esau's relying on this birthright order in order to get his inheritance, and so he thinks he can do whatever he wants with it and still get it. But it displays a lack of faith. It shows a lack of desire for that birthright. And so Jacob gets that from him. So the second overarching theme is the historical events. Eastern religions such as Confucianism, Buddhism, express their beliefs in terms of myths or legends where events took place beyond time and space. The Old Testament consistently presents the theological truth through the medium of history. Because history is part of God's creation, it follows that He is sovereign over human history, and He can alter it if He needs to. The history and teaching of God's covenant with Abraham traveled through history from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not only is history found in biblical text, it is powerful when discovered in our own family history. And so I discovered something in my family history, and it was a process of years that I didn't understand. And in my relationship with my dad, I had some issues as a teenager growing up, and I rebelled and started doing my own thing. When I got saved, I had a lot of experiences in my lost life, experiences with violence, experiences with drunkenness, and experience with anger. So when I got saved, God had set me free from wanting to drink. I didn't want to drink anymore. But I had a problem because after I got saved, there was something wrong. I had a real anger problem. And I'll just make myself vulnerable here, so I hope you don't ever see it, but I can get real angry real easy. And I have to monitor that all the time. I have to bite my tongue until it bleeds. I have to walk away. I have to, do all those things. I'm better than I used to be. You can ask my wife. She's been a very patient saint, and she's got a lot of rewards because of what she's put up for me. But it is hard sometimes for me just to be patient. And I've had a lot of violence training, but I've also had a lot of violent activity in my life. And so that affects a person. And so whether we like it or not, people are affected by their background and their history. Everything that you go through in life can have an effect on you. I know there are a lot of people who just handle life with grace, and because of your faith and because of the Spirit of God, you're able just to say, it's okay. But there are other people who are not affected the same way. And so I would have a lot of people, we'd have preachers come to the mission and preach to the guys and say, if you just give your life to Jesus, He'll take all your addictions away. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I know people personally. I knew men who had a strong, sincere faith in Christ and would go relapse. And for someone to stick a finger in their face and tell them that you just didn't give your life to Jesus, if you would have gave your life to Jesus, it would have worked. And I just want to scream, because after working it, because I used to think the same thing until I met myself, and as I worked with guys at the mission, I discovered that there are people who have a sincere faith, and yet there are things from their past that still hang on. And like Jacob, we'll see in his story, this is why it's a beautiful recovery story. And so I do pastoral counseling. And so this is just what I love doing. So that's why it's not going to be real good, juicy theology like you get with Kevin. I want to talk to you about stories about people And because I really think it's important in the church that when people come into our church, we need to understand that if we want to win the community of Muncie, there's a mess out there. And all you have to do is go to Walmart for like 30 seconds. One of my passions is to make sure, I think Isaac's up there, but I want to make sure my grandkids aren't going to be, and I made sure my kids weren't a Walmart child, because they were not going to scream like that in Walmart. And so Susie and I worked really hard at training our children and loving them, but teaching them respect and, you know, how to act in society. And for me, I came to an awakening one day that I had a real anger problem after I got saved. I put my fist to a wall. Fortunately, I hit drywall and not a 2-by-4. That wouldn't have been a good idea. But I realized too that I had what I call blackout anger. And I probably had some traces of, this may disqualify me, so we may have to cut this off. But I also had some traces of PTSD. And so I was struggling with some things as a Christian. I loved God with all my heart. I loved to worship. I was filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke in tongues when I was baptized in the Holy Spirit and all that. So I was a Spirit-filled believer in Christ. And so I had all that stuff going on for me. And I was just in love with Jesus. And I loved winning lost people. I was a lapel grabber. The first job I got after getting saved, I prayed, and God put me at Pizza King at 12th and Garkey. And that was humbling, but I'll tell you what, I learned more about people there than I did. That was just such a rich place for me to work every day. And I also got to be a Christian who stood up for some things, because I was in the back, and one girl who was delivering pizzas, you know, you come in the back door, and whoever was waiting in line gets the next pizza up. Well, this girl would come in, and there'd be like a big bag with 2 or 3 pizzas in it, and usually a bigger price means a bigger tip. And so she'd grab it and go right back out the door. And so the next time she came in, I skipped my delivery. They said, "Phil, you're up." I said, No, go ahead. Oh, you go ahead and take it. And I waited, and she came in the door, and I got this dead in her face. And everybody else was like freaked out, because they always knew I was a lapel grabbing Christian, wanted lost people to get saved. But I got up in her face, and I told her how wrong she was for ripping everybody else off. And everybody else was like, wow, because they didn't know a Christian could do that. And so learning that balance between confronting, but at the same time, I had a problem with my anger sometimes that it would just go way over the line. And I knew that was a bad witness. I knew that was a bad thing. And I felt like I was one moment walking in darkness and then loving Jesus and wanting to be in the light. And sometimes I still feel that way. And when I read Jacob's story, I see a guy who he is struggling, and I don't think he's really struggling yet, because he's really probably enjoying the benefit of being a deceiver. In these historical events, you see Jacob became really good at deceiving. And I want to kind of lightly talk about it. I'm not blaming parents, okay? Because my son could blame his parents, and I told him at one point, I said, there's going to be one day where you're probably going to come to me when you're about 25. He hasn't done it yet, but there's some point you'll come to me and you'll get down, you'll come talk to me and say, "Dad, you really hurt me when you did this." And you know, that should be a good moment when your children grow up enough they can come back and say, "You know, I really," because you ever make those promises when you say, "I'll never talk to my way to my kids like that," and then you hear your dad coming out of you and you go, "Oh, I did it just now." And so you can't help it. That's just a habit, you know. And I'm not saying, my dad's in heaven right now, and he's a wonderful Christian man. He always led singing in the church. He was a treasurer for the church. My mom played piano. They were wonderful Christians. I have no bad memories of church. We always went to small churches, and those people were the best people in the world. So I have no bad experiences in church. And my dad was a wonderful guy. I know he had a tender heart. But one day I heard his story from my aunt sitting in our family living room during a family get-together, and my aunt began telling me about my grandfather's background. Well, my grandfather died when I was about 2, so I didn't really know him too well. But my grandfather, growing up, I guess this would be prior to Depression, but when he was born, his dad left, abandoned the family. So she was a woman, and back then women didn't really work, and so she couldn't take care of the kids, she felt like, and so she had to put them in an orphanage. So my grandpa was only 2 years old. My uncle was his older brother, was about 4. And they went through this orphanage, and the matrons used to hit him on the head with ladles, beat him on the hands with yardsticks, and all those wonderful nurturing things that people did to try and train children. But they treated orphan kids just like they were dogs in a pound, like they did something wrong to get there. And so eventually they grew up, well, they didn't grow up, they got to an age where they could, and they escaped. They ran away from the orphanage. They ended up at an orchard in Michigan, as the story goes, and they would stand on this big fruit wagon, and they would dance and sing and get people to come over and buy fruit, and they would get paid with fruit. And so that's how they were surviving at that time, just little boys, maybe 6, 7 years old. And then from there, they ran away from there, traveled back down into Indiana. They met a preacher and his wife at a bus station somewhere, or a train station. And this pastor and his wife took these boys in, and then they eventually connected them back with their mother again. And then comes along, as we fast forward, my dad. And they grew up on South Vine down here, and I used to go down to Grandma's and visit on South Vine all the time, but I never knew all this background about the family. My grandmother's father committed suicide, hung himself in his barn up in Red Key. And so I got this history in my background, and I'm thinking, I'm hearing all this stuff now as an adult, and I'm like, what in the world's going on? I mean, we're good Christians who go to church. I never knew this. My dad never told me any of this stuff. And again, I'm not saying that that's all their fault that I'm the way I am. I'm just saying some of this stuff gets passed on, but some doesn't. But my dad, I really think, out of what he went through and experienced from my grandpa, and I don't know. I wasn't there. I never met my grandpa, so I don't know how their family functioned down on South Vine Street. They lived in a real small house. There were 3 kids and two bedrooms. Mom and Dad got one. The boys got the other. Their girl, my aunt, got the back porch. It was enclosed. They made up a little room for her there. But I think they were all treated well. I think they were. But you know, the thing for me, what really helped me connect was this pastor and wife that found these 2 little boys at a train station, took them into their home. And I just wonder if God didn't use that to bring the seeds of faith into my family. And if he hadn't done that, if it hadn't been for a pastor and wife that took these kids in, would I even be where I am right now? And I just kind of wonder about that whole mess back there, but then I see myself going to church every Sunday, Wednesday, and mowing the churchyard on Saturdays. We were always at the church cleaning up and doing stuff. Mom and Dad were faithful to the church. Dad loved singing. He got depressed when he got Parkinson's. He couldn't sing anymore. That's where he just really began to decline. But that was his whole life, was singing in church, leading singing. Had a beautiful voice. He and Mom would do duets together. Everybody wanted to hear Wayne and Joanne sing. And so a good Christian man. Retired from Warner Gear, hardworking. He worked every day. He never took a sick day. He worked during labor disputes. Sorry for putting that in. But we didn't like the union too well because of how they treated him. And so, but he got through all that. He kept working, and his goal was to raise for his family. You know, I'd know every day at 3:30, I would know that my dad was going to be home. I could predict it like clockwork. And if he wasn't home at 3:30 from Warner Gear, which is just a couple miles down the highway, I knew he went to Colonial Bakery to get bread and milk. And sure enough, if it was closer to 4 o'clock, he would come in with a loaf of bread and a couple gallons of milk. Because we drank milk, Dad said, watching me drink milk at supper, he said, it's like pouring sand down a rat hole. And all that stuff down. He had those Dutch hillbilly sayings that I loved. And I just think, you know, where would my family have been? And I don't know who that pastor and wife was, but boy, I sure would. I suppose when I get to heaven, I'll know exactly who they are right away. And I'm going to give them the biggest hug in the world. Because God intervenes in your family at times, and you just think. And I'm sure everybody here can tell stories about your family. And you can think about times that you think, had it not been for God intervening. And I also think about families that are going to come and visit our church. And to have our eyes open that even though they're not all cleaned up, and I know nobody here is, we're not self-righteous, we all, and I meet so many people here, and the first thing my wife and I notice about Glad Tidings is it's just down to earth. That you people are real. And so it makes you feel like being part of this family. It makes you want to jump in. And because of that, when families come into our church, but things are messier than they used to be, Sin has abounded, and our culture is unchurched. We are meeting people now that have never heard of Jesus Christ, which is really a shocker in America. And so, and then they've got all the other teachings out there that they're trying to attract people with, and we are got to be positioned and ready to embrace families when they come in and hear all the blood and guts story of what they've been through, all the abuses and all those things. And be able to assure them that where you're at right now is where God has you, but I assure you He has a plan for the next hour and the next and the next. And God is intervening in your life just like He's intervening in mine. If people could hear your stories, it's not that hard. I don't think it's that hard to witness to people. I was lapel grabbing at Pizza King, and one of the first most important lessons God taught me was quit grabbing lapels. Turn your lights down. You're too excited. Calm down a little bit. You're scaring people off. And I thought I'd just kind of ruined my witness after being there a year and a half. And when I resigned from Pizza King to go up and work with Problem Youth up in Elkhart, they gave me a little going away party. And all these employees came out, and as you know, Shannon Hatton, she worked there also. The employees came out with a Bible, and they all autographed it on the inside cover. And I thought, cool. At least I had some kind of impact there. I thought for sure maybe I just chased everybody off and all that stuff. So our life story can be a story of redemption. In Jacob's life, and again, not throwing all the blame on the family, but he learned deceiving because it was modeled by his grandpa, Abraham. And this is where I was kind of shocked when I first read this. Like, Abraham, man of faith, you're a liar, man. You're lying like a dog. He goes into Genesis, in Genesis 20, he goes and meets this king Abimelech because of the famine. And he goes in there and he says to his wife, Sarah, he says to his wife, and I don't know about you ladies, but I know what my wife would say. Hey, listen, tell him you're my sister because I don't want to get killed. And I'm like, that's a man of faith? You know, you really trust God? And so you're willing to let your wife be taken by somebody else. That's crazy. That he wasn't at his faith level yet. He wasn't there where he had the Isaac faith where he said to his servants, what really to me is a cool statement of faith. He said, we will go and sacrifice and worship. He said, and we will return. That's Abraham saying, I know what's going to happen. Not exactly in detail, but he knew God's faithful. If he did have to sacrifice Isaac, God will provide another son if he has to. But I know this is God's promised son. So there's some kind of plan here. All I know is God told me to go worship and sacrifice my son. So he said, we will go and worship and we will return. That's a statement of faith.
That was only half a lie, because that was
His sister.
his half sister.
Yeah.
So it was only half a lie. It wasn't a full one.
Yeah, technically. But if he'd been wearing a wedding band, he probably would have took it off. Now, the next thing that happens is you see Isaac does the same thing. He meets King Abimelech. Not necessarily that it's the same king. It could be that Abimelech is kind of a title name, but Isaac does the same thing. Now, Jacob is born with a sinful nature. So he's born a sinner. So that's part of his ability to deceive. I don't know, when my mom used to make Toll House cookies and put them out on the cooling rack, and she would say naively, or maybe it was a trap, don't touch these cookies. Sure, Mom. Sure, Mom. Yeah. And yeah, that was not fair. And you know what I used to do too, and nobody taught me this. This was my technique. We had a half wall with a view to the living room and in the kitchen. And by that half wall was a cookie jar. And the stupid thing was made out of ceramic. I hate those things, but I would go in and I would get down low enough that I could get under the half wall and grab the cookie jar lid real quietly, and it took forever. I mean, I thought I was Pink Panther or something. I was trying to steal. I'd lift that lid up and reach in and get a cookie, put the lid back down quietly, and with my mouth watering, I'd run out in the family room and chow down on the cookie. And so, you know, it doesn't take anybody to teach me how to be deceptive. It just comes natural. No, Mom was really nice and trusting, and she shouldn't have been. My dad didn't trust me so well because he knew better. And I was a stubborn, strong-willed child, so I had it coming when it got there. And I grew up with a grandmother that could just look over you with her glass. She'd look over her glasses, and you knew, don't move. Because she saw something, and I don't even know what I did wrong, but I'm just not going to move. She could straighten us kids up in a heartbeat. And she would tell you, she'd say, how old did she say, you're earning a scutcheon, or no, you're earning a scab on your nose, or something like that. In other words, she's going to face slam you if you don't chill out. Now, she raised 6 or 7 kids during the Great Depression, so she wasn't afraid to straighten out kids. She was not a Walmart parent, that's for sure. And so Isaac modeled it for him. He did the exact same thing. And Cain comes to him and tells him, look, God just told me last night. Now here's a pagan king, Philistine. He's not even a good Hebrew. And God spoke to him and he heard it. And he comes to Isaac, who's supposed to be this guy of the promise, and says, God told me what you've done. Well, you're going to cause problems for us. Why'd you do this to us? And so Isaac modeled it, but then what was really, really bad, here's where we get into the dysfunction of the marriage, is Genesis 27, 1 through 17, and this is what I call the sting. This is when the big con takes place. I've been telling stories, so I better hurry up. So Genesis 27 says, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. Here I am, he answered. Isaac said, I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, go out to the open country and hunt some wild game for me. Prepare the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die. Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. When Esau left for the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, bring me some game and prepare some tasty food to eat, so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies. Now here's the deal. Jacob says to Rebekah, his mother, but my brother Esau is a hairy man, while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing. His mother said to him, my son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go out and get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and she prepared some tasty food just the way his father liked it. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which she had in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. She also covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the goat skins. Then she handed to her son Jacob the tasty food and the bread she had made. He went to his father and said, my father. Yes, my son, he answered. Who is it? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing. Isaac asked his son, how did you find it so quickly, my son? Now here's a second chance to tell the truth. The Lord your God gave me success, he replied. So he puts God's name on it. And then Isaac said to Jacob, come near so I can touch you, my son, and know whether you are really my son Esau or not. Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize it, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. Are you really my son Esau, he asked. I am, he replied. Then he said, my son, bring me some of your game to eat, so that I may give you my blessing. Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and he drank. And his father Isaac said to him, come here, my son, and kiss me. So he went to him, he kissed him. When Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him and said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. After Isaac finished blessing him, and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. And we'll stop there. So Jacob's mother, so this is where we see the marriage kind of start getting really separated and divided. She sets this up. Her husband's on the deathbed, and she teaches her son how to con him out of the blessing. Now, she loved her son, but she shouldn't have loved her son more than she loved her husband. And neither should the husband love his son more than his wife. And this is what I have told my wife many times, is one day those kids are going to move out. That's the goal. And when they do, it's you and me. And so I'm looking forward to having a marriage and having a relationship. And that should be the goal. Husbands and wives should never be broken by an allegiance to their children. And that's what happens here. And now I don't understand, and maybe we can make this a question. Why did God, when I first started reading this and studying this, why did God bless Jacob through all his lying and conning? I just thought, Lord, did you see what they just did? And you blessed him, you gave him that inheritance. Why did God honor that?
Well, God told Rebecca how it was going to be. I mean, when the kids were in her womb, he told her that the youngest would be over the oldest. So God knew what was going to happen, and she just followed through with God's plan.
Cool. Was it the right way to follow through on God's plan? Excuse me. Anybody else? It just seemed kind of curious to me that God went ahead and honored that. Although I know that God is sovereign, and yes.
Is there a possibility that God saw something in Jacob that he knew would flourish and make the kingdom of Israel strong?
Sure. Yeah, and I think also, while God foreknows, I'm going to be Arminian here, free will, Wesleyan. I really believe that while God foreknows ahead of time, he doesn't control what people do to a certain point. Although I do see in the sovereignty of God too, that there are times where God may harden like the Pharaoh's heart. And he can do that for his purposes. So with the Pharaoh, I believe Pharaoh already had a hard heart. And so God hardened his heart even more so that he could get Israel to see. And not only that, the people of Israel that were in Egypt, they saw the miraculous things that God did through the plagues. But also the Egyptians saw it. And some of those Egyptians who may not have otherwise had faith, they saw the power of God because the Pharaoh's heart was hardened. I think the same thing with Esau. I think Esau's heart was already hard, and God already knew that about him, even because God knows us from before the foundations of the earth. He creates us. He knows every thought before it ever comes into being. I mean, he's sovereign and powerful that way. He knows everything about me. He knew when I was going to do stupid things in my life. And I can tell you this, I look back and I was jumping out of planes, and I've been shot at, and I've been spit on and beaten and done all kinds of stupid stuff. And even in the midst of that, God said, because I was a kid, I went to church, I knew the right way. And I knew too that when I was 18, 19, 20, I was rebelling against the right way. I knew it inside of me. I knew this is wrong, this feels wrong, but I kept doing it. And while I was doing that, I think God said, yeah, Phil, you chose to go that direction, but guess what, buddy? I'm going to bring you right back around. Because everything you've gone through and everything you've experienced by your choice, I'll use for my glory. That's just how, and I'm glad God allowed me to, His grace, He allowed me to be stupid. Because I did some things I should have been dead. And yet, He brought it back around and says, now, I'll use you. But it took me getting on my knees and saying, I am so sorry for the way I've lived. Yes, sir.
Well, in Esau, he became a nation of warriors. Jacob was just the opposite. If you go back to Abraham,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, some people can really strain their brains over it. I had a friend, I was at, up in Elkhart working with problem youth, and I had a friend that was a student at Moody, or just graduated Moody, and he was working there. And he told me, he said, it's kind of, he sees it both ways. There's a sovereignty and a predestining of God, but there's also free will. I don't know why we have to lock God into one box or the other. But we always do this. We try to get God into one theological box. And even though we say we don't want to put a God in a box, we do it all the time because we say, well, I believe in this. Well, why can't God be predestining, electing, and at the same time honoring our free will? He can do both because he's not like us. We get locked into one thing and he's both. And that's kind of what I want to kind of provoke that question. Kevin kind of cautioned me. So I wanted to throw that out there. I don't want to start any fights or anything. And I don't want you to beat me up either, okay? So I think the back door's been locked, so I'm going to go out that way. So Esau had a hard heart, yes.
Just because we have free will doesn't mean that God doesn't know what choice we're going to make.
Exactly.
I mean, we have the will to make it, but that doesn't mean he doesn't know the future and know what steps we're going to take.
Yeah. He knew where I was going to be, and that's what I thought about one day. I was jumping out of a plane in the military, and you hook up these static lines, and you feel the cable going like this, and as I'm headed toward the door, I'm thinking this could be it. And this really isn't really rational, but I just thought, well, if my time's up, my time's up, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, I'd rather my time be up on the ground, not up there. So, but it kind of comforted me, because as a kid, I learned that God's in control of life and death. Now, I was lost, I was drinking, I was doing stupid stuff, but jumping out of a plane, it helped me, because you're at that moment where you feel really kind of scared, and then you go, wait a minute. You kind of roll back on God. It's kind of that foxhole theology. So, yeah, God is in control, and he already knows our choices ahead of time, and he's still letting us make those choices. Now, that'll drive you crazy if you think about it. It's like trying to figure out where God, how did he always exist? Just don't worry about it. And so God does give us free will. Now, I think what's a good caution is to understand that I have a free will to rebel against God too. And so even though I can rebel against God, that doesn't mean that because he foreknows that I'm going to rebel, that he's happy about it, or he's like, well, that's okay, it's part of my plan. I don't think God has a plan for rebellion. That wouldn't make any sense. So I have free will, and God is sovereign. Now, my rebellion, God said, I'll use that. Now, if I would have chosen another path, I think he would have brought my life back around from that path. If I would have went to school and seminary and counseling school and all that, I think God would have still used it that direction. But because of the choices I made, God was able to use it in his sovereignty anyway. So all of this deceiving goes on. This is the third overarching theme, the fallen condition of humanity. Mom tells Jacob how to lie. She even does a good makeup job with hair and everything else, and Dad buys into it. And then the next thing is Esau walks in, and that is in verse 19, 27. No, 30, 31. So verse 30 of 27, after Isaac finished blessing him and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. And he said to him, my father, please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. His father Isaac asked him, who are you? I am your son, he answered, your firstborn Esau. Isaac trembled violently. And I like that expression, because it doesn't just say, Isaac got upset. He trembled violently. And then he said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed. And so Isaac knows that God's going to honor that blessing, even though it was done wrong. And again, God already knew that Jacob was going to be the one. So Esau heard his father's words. He burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, bless me too, my father. But he said, your brother came and deceitfully and took your blessing. Esau said, isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taking my blessing. And then he asked, haven't you reserved a blessing for me?" Isaac answered Esau, "I have made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father." Then Esau wept aloud. His father Isaac answered him, "Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heavens above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw off his yoke from off your neck." Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob." Unforgiveness is always murder, whether it be emotionally or spiritually. It is definitely murder. So next week, I want to talk about God's redemptive plan and Jacob's character growth through trials. And this too connects with where I've been in my journey, is that God takes you for a period of time, and what you're going through, He is teaching you and moving you toward His divine purpose. And so Jacob's story models that as well. And we'll see that Jacob kind of goes back and forth between being the name Israel, one who contends with God, and going back to being Jacob, one who deceives. And one time God will call him Jacob, the next time He calls him Israel. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Jacob keeps relapsing back into his old behavior again. So I would like to end with a moment of prayer. And I don't know if anybody has any prayer right now, any prayer requests. If you know of a family that needs prayer, I would certainly like to do that right now. Or if your family, you have members in your family that need prayer, and you would like to speak that, we can pray for that. Again, the model of God working in families and changing lives. And that's what God does. That redemption process. So I love reading these character stories and drawing that out. I hope I've done that for you well today.